everyone, it's Thursday and it's time for Reading for Pleasure. So we have just got to the point where Margaret has left Robert and she's meant to be going to get back on a lifeboat, and we are going to have to see what happens to Robert because he didn't want Margaret to stay with him. He was insistent that she got on a boat, so let's see what happened. So this chapter is just called Still Later. I was crying, but I returned to the lifeboat area. I had promised, so that was what I did. There were still plenty of passengers around, most of them men, but the boats all seemed to be gone. I swallowed, knowing that I had missed my opportunity and would now have to take my chances along with the people who remained. I should never have allowed Robert to leave, as we could have tried to swim to safety together. But I had promised. For now, I sank into an empty deck chair to absorb the inevitability of my fate. The bow seemed to be almost underwater, so it would not be long now. The orchestra was still nobly playing away, and I took great comfort from listening to the music. I thought momentarily of writing in this diary, but instead I took out Hamlet and began to thumb through the pages. "Margie Jane," a deep voice said, "what are you still doing here? I was certain you and Mrs. Carstairs had long since left." It was Mr. Prescott, who had dined with us along with his wife so many times during the voyage. I scarcely knew him, but it was wonderful to see a familiar face. "She left earlier," I said. "Where is Mrs. Prescott?" His expression tightened, and I deeply regretted having asked the question at all. "I sent her on ahead," he answered. "Now, come, quickly, to the promenade with me. We may just have time." We went down there, and I saw a number of women and children climbing across a bridge of deck chairs to get into a lifeboat. There was one left. I felt elated and inconsolably guilty at the thought of getting on board. "You and the men," I started. Mr. Prescott cut me off. "We have no time for idle chatter. Please, just come along." Then he raised his voice. "Let us through, please, gentlemen. I have a young girl here." Men moved aside without the slightest thought for themselves. There are not sufficient words in the English language to honour their gallantry, but I will never forget it, any of it, as long as I may live. Colonel Astor was there, helping his young wife across a treacherous bridge of chairs. I heard him ask if he could stay with her due to her condition, but the officer refused him. The colonel accepted this gracefully and asked the number of the boat so he would be able to find her in the morning. Then he moved away, his dog Kitty trailing behind. A woman was trying to board with her children, but the officer stopped her son and told him to go back and stand with the men. A man, who must have been his father, protested that the lad was only 13. The officer in charge scowled, but let him pass. Another woman was clutching her young son. Then he was wearing a woman's hat. I am not sure who put it on his head, but it must have been Colonel Astor. After that, she and her children were allowed aboard with no comment from the officers. I wished so very much that Robert would find his way here. At only 16, they might let him on board as well. Except that I knew they would not, and he would not. "Quickly now," Mr. Prescott said to me. "We mustn't hold things up." I did not know what to do, but found myself impulsively hugging him. "You are a perfect gentleman, sir," I said, "and a credit to us all." He smiled and let his hand rest gently on my head for a second. "Come on now, child, it's time. Mind the chairs." Then, just like that, I was half climbing, half falling into the lifeboat. I recovered my balance and made my way to a seat in the bow. As I sat down, the cry to "Lower away" went up, and my end of the boat dropped towards the water. Next, the bow dropped, and we continued in that erratic fashion. The last thing I saw was Kitty, noble in her own right, staying close by her master's side. The Titanic was so low in the water that we had a very short trip down. We made progress, and one of the two sailors aboard reached for a knife to cut us free, but then we hit the water and we were able to cast off. The portholes were still brightly lit, but I could see water rising unchecked through sea deck and making its way upwards. "My God," a woman near me whispered. "She really is going down." All around us, heavy objects were crashing into the ocean. At first I feared that the remaining passengers on the ship had gone mad, but then I understood that the deck chairs and other wooden articles could be used for flotation devices. We had only 2 men aboard, so another sailor came sliding down the ropes to join us. Several more followed in his wake, landing heavily in the boat. A number of women were knocked down and badly bruised as a result. Anyone who was near an oar grabbed hold and started rowing. I was too far forward to be of any help, and besides, I was unable to take my eye off that beautiful stricken ship in what appeared to be her death. "Row with all your might," a man was yelling, "before we get sucked under." First they rowed one way and then we reversed direction. I had no sense that anyone was in charge. Two men who had taken a chance and jumped off the ship now swam towards us, their arms flailing wildly. They were hauled aboard, shivering from just that brief period in the freezing water. Even then, to my amazement, I could hear the brave sounds of violins being played aboard the ship. As the bow began to disappear completely, there was an enormous din of shattering glass and crashing metal from inside the ship. People were leaping into the water from all directions, while others scrambled towards the stern in a frantic, hopeless attempt to save themselves. No one in our boat spoke, or perhaps even breathed. The horror of these last moments was too awful to watch, but it was impossible to look away. Several women gasped as the Titanic's front funnel suddenly ripped free and smashed violently into the water, and then her stern rose higher in the air. I am not sure if the engine rooms had exploded or if the ship broke in half, but amidst all the crashing noises, the bow had gone under, and slowly the stern was lifted straight up into the sky. I could hear distant screams as people were thrown off or else struggled to hang on. The ship's lights were abruptly extinguished, and then came back on for one final second before we were all plunged into utter darkness. The clamour of smashing, crashing, tearing metal seemed endless. The stern stayed straight up in the air like that, a stark shadow against the stars for what seemed like an hour, but may have only been a minute. Then, with an almost stately grace, he gradually slid beneath the surface of the ocean. The Titanic was gone. Tuesday the 16th of April 1912, Carpathia. I had to stop and return to my diary in the harsh light of day, because the next part is the worst of all. After the Titanic sank, the unspeakable shrieking of hundreds of people dying filled the night. Frenzied, terrified screams. Since we were still very close to where the ship had sunk, I could distinguish individual voices begging for help, calling out for people they loved and praying for salvation. "We must go back," one of the women in my boat said, her voice shaking. "We must help them." "We can't," another woman shouted, nearly hysterical. "They'll kill us all. No one can help them anymore. We have to save ourselves." Everyone chimed in with their own opinions. I was very much in favour of returning, and a near mutiny nearly developed. Finally, a ship's quartermaster named Perkis made the decision that we were so close we had to try. He said that he was in charge and we would follow his orders. So our boat began to row back, and we were able to pull 5 or 6 half-frozen men out of the water. Each time I prayed that one of them would be Robert, and each time my prayers were not answered. One of the men was clutching a bottle of brandy, and Quartermaster Perkis tossed it overboard, since the man was obviously already intoxicated and might become unruly. The rescued men were drenched, and a goodly amount of water had spilled into the boat as we struggled to haul them in. It was deep enough to cover my boots completely. Most of the men were in a very bad way, and I offered the closest one to me my coat. He was too cold to respond, so I just took it off and covered him as well as I could. The screams of the dying seemed to last forever. It was a horrifying, unearthly sound that would have sickened the very devil himself. I am not sure which was worse, the screams themselves or the way they gradually faded away. I think we had enough room in our boat to try rescue a few more, but now we were rowing in a different direction, and the quartermaster could not be persuaded otherwise. The rescued men's teeth were chattering, and some of them were out of their heads from the cold. Other than trying to help them get warm, no one knew what else to do. It was pitch black except for the stars, and even Quartermaster Perkis did not seem sure about which way we should go. As far as I know, we were just rowing around in circles. After a while we heard a whistle blowing and rowed towards it. A boat commanded by an officer Lowe wanted as many lifeboats as possible to tie up together for safety. I think that there were 3 other boats who responded to his call, and Officer Lowe transferred all of his passengers into our boats. He's planning to return to the site where we had last seen the Titanic and try to rescue some more people. While we waited for him to return, our boats drifted aimlessly. There were a number of children as well as a few babies on our lifeboat, and some of them cried on and off. Obviously there was no milk to give them to soothe their distress. I tried to help one woman by rocking her baby for a while, but had no more success calming him than anyone else had. Between the crying babies, a few seasick women, and the ravings of the frozen men, one of whom was also very drunk, ours was not a quiet boat. On the whole, I do not remember any conversations. There may have been some, but I just cannot remember. I think I just sat there in utter despair. 2 of the women near me were weeping, but most had been silenced by a combination of grief, shock, and the terrible cold. Anyone who was not fortunate enough to be rowing, which served as an excellent distraction, just hunched down and tried to stay warm. At some point, 2 of the men we had pulled aboard succumbed to the ordeal and died. After that, the silence aboard our boat was impenetrable. Officer Lowe returned with only 4 more survivors, all of them strangers, and then directed us to begin rowing again. A sailor caught sight of another boat with figures standing up on it. He said that it was one of the collapsible emergency boats, and she looked to be in grave danger of capsizing. With Officer Lowe's encouragement, we rowed over there with one of a lifeboat, boat 12, I think. Between us, we were able to take on all 18 or 20 men. Again, Robert was not among them. Maybe he was on another lifeboat, or was clinging safely to some wreckage, or I could not face it, the possibility. By now our boats were very crowded and the water inside reached to my knees. Had the sea not been so calm, we would surely have been swamped. When a passenger first shouted that she saw a ship, none of us believed her. The men told her that it was probably only a shooting star, or maybe dawn beginning to break. But as the lights loomed closer, we realised that it was a steamer, and she was heading our way. For the first time, we all had a feeling of hope. The sky was getting brighter, and the steamer was still coming towards us. As the new morning dawned, the sky pink and light blue, I was stunned to see that we were surrounded by a mountain range of icebergs. In the dark, they had been completely invisible, but now they were everywhere. For objects so lethal, they were also majestic and almost beautiful in a horrid way. Someone in our boat looked at her watch and announced that it was getting on for 5 in the morning. I felt as though time in the boat had lasted for months, so I was surprised only a few hours had passed. The rescue steamer proceeded cautiously through the ice field. Every so often it would stop to take aboard the occupants of a lifeboat. Our boat rowed in their direction, but we did not get to her side until almost 8 o'clock. Up close I could see that our saviour was called the Carpathia. There were ladders and cloth slings hanging over the side to help us aboard. Many of the people in our boat were too weak to climb, but I chose a ladder. As I reached the deck, a uniformed man helped me aboard. As he asked me my name and wrote it down, a woman pressed a mug of hot liquid into my hands and wrapped a blanket around my shoulders. I lurched off the side, out of the way, so that others could also come aboard. A great many survivors were waiting by the railing, searching for loved ones and friends. We were one of the last boats to be picked up, so I knew that their hopes were growing faint. My legs were shaking, so I sat down on the deck and sipped the hot liquid. The taste was unexpected, but I recognised the smell as coffee. There may have been some brandy in there as well. A kind-faced woman knelt next to me and offered to show me to the saloon so I could get warm. Once in there, someone else handed me a sandwich and my mug was refilled. By and by, a doctor stopped to examine me and pronounced me perfectly fit and extremely lucky. I was none too sure of the former, but utterly certain of the latter. I must say that the commander of the Carpathia, Captain Rostron, was terribly heroic. Having seen those treacherous ice fields, I have no idea how he made his way to us without his own ship crashing. Once all the lifeboats had been emptied, he steered his ship over to the area where the Titanic had gone down in search of more survivors. Alas, there were none to be found, and there was not even much debris to be seen. Another ship, the Californian, arrived around then, and they were to continue the search while we headed for New York. Before we steamed away, Captain Rostron gathered all of us together for a brief service. He and a reverend gave thanksgiving for the approximately 700 of us who had been saved, and then led us in prayer in memory of the more than 1,500 people who had been lost. 1,500 people. As soon as I felt stronger, I began to look around to see if anyone I knew had survived. There were so few men, and I never found Robert, or Mr. Prescott, or Mr. Hollins, or Ralph Kittery, or so many others. Colonel Astor had not survived, and neither had Mr. Andrews, or Captain Smith, or Dr. O'Loughlin, or my mind just could not accept the enormity of the loss of all those fine people. Especially, of course, Robert. I should never have left him alone like that, no matter how hard he begged. Surely, if he was brave enough to accept his fate, I should have been as well. I think the Titanic's crew may have suffered the most devastating amounts of deaths. Stewards, cooks, engineers, postal workers, even the entire band perished. How admirable they were. How admirable all of them were. Steerage passengers also fared far worse than the rest of us, although those in the second class had a great many die also. I am sure there were countless stories of people being heroes among their ranks, which will never be told, as so few eyewitnesses are allowed to tell them. This afternoon I was sitting out on the deck half asleep when I heard a familiar bark. I opened my eyes to see Florence tugging at her lead and trying to pull Mrs. Carstairs in my direction. Mrs. Carstairs saw me and looked very pleased. "What an agreeable surprise," she said. "I was so very concerned. Now that I have found you, you must come and join me for the rest of the voyage." I shook my head, too exhausted and sad to face that notion. "Thank you, but I would rather be alone just now." She stared at me dumbfounded. "But—" "Robert died," I said, and came very close to bursting into tears. She nodded, her expression more serious than I had ever seen it. "I'm sorry, child. I know how fond you were of him." I nodded and rubbed my hand across my eyes, trying very hard not to cry. To my surprise, Mrs. Carstairs dragged over a deck chair by herself and sat next to me. "My Frederick would have died too," she said, "with Thomas Prescott and all the others, and I would have been on that lifeboat thinking that he would be perfectly fine." We were now safely in a ship surrounded by widows. She was, indeed, lucky that Mr. Carstairs had not made the voyage. We sat in silence, for there seemed to be little to say. Then I let out my breath. "Thank you," I said, "for I should have been in steerage, and therefore almost certainly would have also died in those icy waters." Mrs. Carstairs nodded, set Florence on my lap, and we sat there together without speaking for the rest of the afternoon. Wednesday the 17th of April 1912, Carpathia. We are supposed to arrive in New York tomorrow night. During the last couple of days I have done little more than write and think even more. I am not hungry. For the most part I have not slept. The Carpathia's passengers have been uniformly sensitive and benevolent. They have donated clothes to those who have none, along with toothbrushes and other necessities. Some of them have even given up their beds. I decided that I would be more comfortable on the floor of the saloon or outside on the deck. For those of us in that position, the ship provided steamer rugs and blankets to try to make us comfortable. When my parents died in such quick succession, I thought my whole world had come to an end. I could not understand why they had died or how life could be so cruel, and now I do not understand why I survived when so many others did not. And why did not every single lifeboat return to help our fellow human beings? Had we not already been so close, I do not think our boat would have gone back either. People were too frightened, too confused, too self-protective to remember others, but we had room. All of the lifeboats did. Fear seems a pathetic excuse. We were all afraid that night. I know I did not want to die, but then neither did I want to abandon others to their helpless frozen fate. Although I suppose that is exactly what I did by virtue of taking my seat on boat number 4 in the first place. I abandoned Robert. I doomed complete strangers. I hope that I can work out some way to understand all this. Why it happened, what could have prevented it, how to keep anything like this from ever taking place again. Most of all, I hope I can learn how to forgive myself for still being alive when so many others are not. Thursday the 18th of April 1912, New York. We steamed into New York Harbour at 8:30 p.m. in the midst of a fierce thunderstorm. Somehow, given the circumstances, that seemed only fitting. Smaller boats surrounded us, and many of the bright flashes we saw came from cameras, not lightning. Then, when we finally berthed, I could see a tremendous crowd waiting for us on the pier. Before we disembarked, I saw Mrs. Carstairs making her way towards me. Awkwardly, she tried to hand me one of her typical wads of folded banknotes. "Here," she said, "I thought you might need this." I shook my head. "No, thank you. You have already done more than I deserve." "Take it, it's a pittance," she said, sounding impatient. "My address is there too, if you need anything." I hesitated, then slowly nodded and tucked the money into my pocket. I was about to land in a foreign country with no idea of what was going to happen or where I was going to go, and the few pounds I had were now at the bottom of the ocean. "Will your brother be here to meet you?" she asked. Would he? "Yes," I said uncertainly. "Everything has been arranged." Of course this was not true, but what did it matter? She nodded, and then we looked at each other. "It is not for us to know why we survived," she said. "Try to remember that, Margaret." I hoped very much that that was true. The gangways had been laid out now, and the first group of numb, tired passengers began to get off. When it came to be my turn, I followed those who had gone ahead, looking neither right nor left. It was a chaotic scene as people searched for loved ones and reporters rushed around with notepads trying to get stories. I ignored all of this, only wanting to get off the pier and find a quiet place to sit down. Mrs. Carstairs had located her son-in-law, and she offered to drive me to the railway station or a hotel, but I assured her that I was fine. I thanked her one last time, she shook my hand, and then I bent to give Florence a light kiss on the top of her head. That was the last time I saw them. Whilst they had left, I stood alone in the frantic crowd, trying not to panic. Where was I going to go? I was in the middle of a strange city with nothing more than the clothes on my back and a few dollars. It was upsetting to have so many people swarming around me, and it took me quite some time to make it to a quiet street corner across the way. I wanted to sob loudly, but was afraid of drawing attention to myself. Gradually, the crowds began to thin out. Every so often, someone would stop and ask me eagerly if I'd been on the Titanic, and I would just shake my head. It was easier that way. I'd so hoped that William would be here, but I did not know where to start looking. For all I knew, he thought I had perished at sea. Maybe I'd never even received the letter I sent from St. Abernathy's. I did not want to leave in case he was here, but maybe I should try to find a room for the night. Then tomorrow I would have to work out some way to get to Boston. Slowly I got up and began to walk around a little more. I was still surrounded by strangers and the whole scene was overwhelming. If I could just sleep for a while, maybe I would feel better and could think more clearly. After all, this would not be the first time I had slept on the streets. A woman standing by two tall bundles of apparently donated clothing asked me if I needed help, but I just shook my head. I've accepted far too much charity in my life and no longer want to do so. Ever. I finally found a deserted bench near the shipping office. At first I just sat down, but when no one seemed to notice me, I stretched out and closed my eyes. Maybe if the sun came up, I would know what to do. I was almost asleep when I suddenly felt someone sit down next to me and a hand touch my shoulder. I opened my eyes, terrified, and then recognised my brother. "There you are," William said, his eyes filling with tears. I was worried sick. I began crying too and hugged him with what little strength I had left. William hugged back and I rested my head against his shoulder, not even noticing the pouring rain. I was finally safe. Right, and we are going to leave that there for today, so come back tomorrow and we are going to finish the story. Okay, see you tomorrow, bye bye.